And we are live. This is awesome. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. This was another series of the Curious Leaders Path. And today we're going to talk about the role of ego in healthy leadership. And so there's three of us that are here, which is Todd, Katerina, her cat, and myself, Joanne. So we will be, going through this conversation. You can add any chats in or any comments and stuff like that in the chat as well. So let's kick this off. Let's get going. We have 30 minutes, so let's have some fun. I'm curious. First off, what is the definition of ego? Like, how do we define ego?
You want to start, Todd?
Sure. I'll throw it out. I'll throw out what I think it is, and then we'll go from there. And before I start, I want to say, hey, Christine, because we see you. Christine's in the chat. She's already given us a hello. So hi, Christine. So ego's for me, it's my sense of self. It's my sense of who I am and how I define myself. And maybe that's good and maybe that's not good, and certainly it's served me well, and it's also served me not so well in my life. So I will admit freely that my interpretation and my definition of ego as I apply it to myself is evolving. What do y'all think?
Yeah, Kat, what's going on
there? I actually looked up what the definition of ego is, because I think a lot of people have totally different definitions of it. And what I think is really interesting about what you said, Todd, is it kind of gets to this idea of your consciousness versus your non-conscious. And that's one of the definitions. But there's also definitions of it's a reflection of your self-esteem. And I would say it's actually how we value ourselves. So, and I think this idea of value and self-value is really important and we can do that in two axes. Let's see if I can get that on screen. So one axis is what's your actual value to whoever, whatever context you're in, because obviously our value is different in different circumstances. And the other axis is how much do you recognize your value? Because there's a lot of people who are super high value people, but they don't recognize it. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are maybe not so high value, but they overestimate what value they bring to the table, right? So there's not always a correlation between the actual value we bring in that context compared to how we feel about it. And I think ego is all of those things. I think ego is identity and our self-identity, and connected to that is our sense of value. And it also is a reflection of what's happening physiological inside of us. Which is really important signals to say, are we on track with who we want to be, or are we not? And that's kind of correlated with value. So I think there's lots of ideas in this concept of ego.
I think what comes up to me, and here is, ego is also here to keep me safe.
Oh, that's so important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's an aspect of it. My identity's in there, but it sits there and screams a lot at me when I'm going outside of a boundary, which is which I've never done before. Right. So it wants to keep me safe within that space, within the definition of, I know what Joanne is. 100%, Christine. Yeah.
Thanks, Christine.
Yeah. So it's like a guard dog, at the fence sometimes. What? And that's what comes up for me when I think of ego, right? So it's telling me we're it's there to keep me safe, right?
Wow.
And in that case, if we talk about whether ego is useful, not useful, good, bad, if we want to put value judgments on it, I think what we have to recognize is if we're listening to those signals that we might call ego or warning or whatever, is the difference between good ego and bad ego, obviously in quotation marks, is if we're being defensive, if we're being protective, if we're being closed and saying, this is the way I am and this is the way I'll always be, then it's not constructive, the ego.
Mhm.
However, if we're listening to those signals, the physiological signals, often they're from our body that we experience as emotion, but not always. And if we're actually listening to those signals and saying, yep, I feel really uncomfortable and my ego feels threatened, I feel like somebody's challenging me, and what we then have to say is that a legitimate threat, or is this actually an opportunity that feels threatening? Yeah, so I think that's where we start differentiating between the good and the bad of ego.
Oh, and Kat, what's showing up for me when you say that is that sounds and feels a lot like sort of navigating anxiety responses.
Yeah.
And wow, because I came into this conversation imagining that ego was mostly a cognitive thing. And I think, as I listen to you two, I'm thinking, wow, that's really interesting. And like so much else, it's really not just a cognitive thing, it's an emotional thing. Right? Like it doesn't just live in this part of my head. It lives in my whole body. And that's oh, that's juicy.
Well,
I'm not entirely sure what to do with that yet.
It's interesting because the head is doing the comparison, right?
Mhm.
So the head has to get involved with comparing to is this right or is this not right? So it's actually the one that's sort of like that feeling or whatever that's probably being assessed by the head with the story and all that stuff. Yeah,
Right.
it's pretty. Oh, there's so much there. And let's talk about ego isn't a bad thing. And so
Yes.
I like to understand why ego isn't a bad thing to you guys. Because we've heard, we've heard so much about ego's bad, right? But it can be a good thing, right? So yeah, what do you guys?
Can I pop in for that one, Kat? Because I'll tell you when I first thought, oh, this is a conversation we need to have. My initial thought on it was, well, what about those times when we lead with ego, and what that feels like? And to me, that has been a negative, right? Leaders, when I've experienced leadership that's come from ego, or when I have been a leader who has led from ego, there's always been an element of that threat response that you're talking about, Joanne. And I gotta admit, so ego isn't bad. When we were first talking about this, that was a challenging thing for me to hear, because so much of what we've heard, not within this podcast, but so much of what I've heard about and talked about in the past has been about sort of how do we set aside our ego so that we can sort of see things or be more curious or whatever, and not feel that weird threat. So I'm challenged with ego isn't a bad thing, although I recognize that it isn't a bad thing. But I'm not sure what to do with that.
Well, it's interesting for me, and a cat. I mean, I just want to throw this in here, but sometimes I think that ego and conceited are being squished,
Yes.
right? And so we associate someone who's ego to like conceited, and so I think, and we know conceit like basically is, we feel that conceited is a bad thing.
I think if we want to put some metrics around when is ego good or not. And I don't think this is necessarily the best metric, but just to sort of go back to this axis of what's the actual value we're delivering and what's our sense of the value we're delivering, is as long as we're sort of on this equilibrium point of where our sense of value is relatively proportional to the actual value we deliver, then I think it's healthy ego. If we're overestimating, then we're being conceited. If we're underestimating, then we're being, I don't know what the right word is, weak, underestimating ourselves. I mean, there's all sorts of words we can use on that. So I think that's one metric. And then there's other things as well, of going back to what we were talking about earlier on, which is really, I'm a believer that, so when we talk about neuroscience, it often talks about neuroscience and looking at brain science. But neuroscience, and there's a lot of research around this, but there's a real split in the trauma world, the, you know, anything to do with psychology loosely or directly. There's a real split between the people who are focused on cognitive therapy and cognitive processes versus whole body processes, which is basically your whole nervous system. Yeah. And we've talked about this in previous sessions, but we have sort of the head brain, the heart brain, the gut brain, and then there's some other brains as well, which basically is a concentration of nerves where there's a lot of processing. And just to give legitimacy to this idea of the cardiac nervous system and the enteric nervous system, the heart and the gut nervous system, there actually is now evidence to say that we have information processing and information storage in each of these nervous system regions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that our brain, and our brain is, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that our brain is kind of like the last part of our decision-making and behavior process. If you believe that the nervous system actually, which I 100% do, if our nervous system is actually guiding our whole nervous system, which includes our head brain, but is not dominated by our head brain, in that case, then every physiological signal we have is designed to either help us survive and or thrive and to protect us. And I think the ego is our self-identity aspect of that. So as long as we're listening to the signals and really spending time to think about, am I protecting my identity? Am I protecting my sense of self and therefore closed to ideas? Then our ego is not healthy. However, if we're saying, ooh, I don't like what this person is asking me, or I don't like the situation because I'm feeling inadequate, you know, whatever the response is, I feel unsafe in some way. If we can acknowledge that and then say, now what do I do with it? How can I make myself feel safe? How can I experiment? How can I be open to somebody that I feel is threatening me? And how can I manage my power while also learning? Yeah, so ego is about maintaining the power that we deserve to have, not what we feel we deserve to have, but the power that we really should have in certain circumstances. And how do we manage that power while managing ourselves when we feel powerless or low power? Yeah, so
You know,
I think this is what hits into some of the stuff that I think of, like why it's a good thing. Like it's just there's an aspect of it that it's part of who we are. Like it's just, we're human, we're all born with it, like it's there, like it's just, and it is a survival, I feel a survival function. And it gives us that, like who we are, and there's a lot of what we said before. I think from my perspective, acknowledging, yes, that's who I am. I have an ego, and that's okay. Like I feel that sometimes we kind of push that down and put it a bad thing, and it'll pop up, right? So just acknowledge, you know, it's okay. We have it, and now it's really determining. It's like a feeling in a way too, right? But now we can determine how to be with it. And I think for me, the usefulness of it, and we were talking about it earlier, was when you hit that boundary, right? When I feel unsafe. So it's telling me unsafe, you're unsafe, whatever. It's just, you're not doing something you normally would do. And so for me, then it gives me an opportunity to kind of like calm down, you know, take it as a trigger signal to look at just exactly what you're saying, Kat, to calm it down, figure out now how I can kind of move through that and grow, like, and expand, right? Because it's almost like letting ego know it's okay. We can do this. We're fine, you know, and we have to, you know, kind of get through that wall or jump into that cold part of the water. So that's why what happens when I think it's good, I think it is who we are. So, you know, I think we're good. But that's what comes up for me when I feel that it's a good thing, right?
Yeah. And
do we want to pop into the next topic? Or sorry, Todd, were you going to say something else?
Well, no, I was going to say, like, I think I'm just looking at the chat too, and both Christine and Vic have mentioned that, you know, very similar things, right? That that, you know, it's reactionary about when it feels threatened, and when our safe space is compromised. Like I'm hearing all of that stuff. And Vic, I love what you just brought in too, about, you know, the goal of the ego is to continue existing, and I think if all of that is put together, well, you know, if we're in a situation that threatens identity, which is what you're describing, Joanne, well then, yeah, that can become very closed and very, you know, very hardened. And when I think of leading with ego, that's the space that my head goes to. So what I'm really curious about is, how do we lead with ego without being in that closed space?
Yeah. The thing that
I may have
comes up.
taken us in a direction that we weren't.
Yeah, no.
I
Well, I as a leader, I think we need to recognize that this is what triggers other people too, right? So
Yes.
that's what was coming up for me was we need to be, we know it triggers, we know it's a triggering thing for us, and we realize how it's, when we become unsafe, this is how it gets triggered. And being able to have conversations about that when it is triggered, like especially within a team or anything else. Like what do we do to kind of help you through that? If it does get, I shouldn't say triggered, sorry, activated is a better word. If it gets activated. So, and how do we want to be with that? And it's okay. Like, it's okay if it happens. It's just like, sometimes it pushes us into that unsafe reactionary world, which doesn't allow us to really be fully present in that space. So we need to, calm it down in a bit, right?
Yeah. And I think it's important also to recognize that if the ego is threatened, it's an existential threat, me as an entity, not as a body. Yeah, but it still triggers the nervous system in the same way. And that's kind of what Bruno's getting at as well, right? Is that, yeah.
Here, I'll pull it up. There we go.
Oh, yeah, I love this. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Go ahead, Kat. Sorry about that.
Yeah. And I think, I'm curious who's on the call today, because what we also had talked about before our call is, what are the cultural elements of this? Because as women and men, I think we're socialized differently on how we're allowed to relate to our egos. So I worked in the financial industry for a very long time, and egos lead. You have to walk in the room with as a man, you have to walk in the room with a big chest and, shoulder square, and, and it's all about confidence and demonstrating capability. But often it's overinflated. Often it's much more than it really is warranted. While as women, we're kind of supposed to play small. I'm being very polite.
I have a closet full of suits that do exactly that.
Exactly. I think all of us kind of have those things in our closets that we're not wearing anymore. Thank God to COVID, eh? Yeah. And life changes. And as women, we're supposed to play a little bit small, and we're not supposed to have egos. But the reality is we do, and we just express them in different ways.
Yeah.
When I lived in Japan, there's totally different expectations that are more cultural expectations about how you show ego and how you don't show ego, and how your, humility is really important. And ego is actually considered a real negative trait, much more so than it is here. So even being confident, the way that healthy North Americans would express ego, might actually be considered impolite, inappropriate in Japan. Now, I lived there a very long time ago, so I'm sure things have evolved since then, but there definitely is an element of that in the culture. And then when I lived in Europe, there's different ways, the different countries where I've worked with people from different countries in Europe, the way that they show their ego and their confidence and their capabilities is very different than North Americans do. So I'm curious what other people's experiences are in terms of what the cultural elements of ego are, and what's considered healthy ego and not healthy ego. And Joanne and Todd, I mean, you guys have worked in different professions as well, different industries and different companies. So you've probably seen it there as well, that different industries will express it differently. Different professions will have different boundaries around what healthy ego is.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, the thing that resonates most for me when you describe that, Katerina, is the gender. The gender difference, right? Because as a sensitive man operating within the context of traditional masculine ego in corporations, because I also worked in financial for a while, is peculiar. It never fit like, you know, I wore the suits, but they never really fit right. And in that sense, you know, from a gender perspective, ego felt like performance. Oh, I'm. It's funny. I said that, and Joanne, you moved around, and now I'm really curious what that was.
Right, like because the one thing that started to come up for me when you started to talk about this is like ego is like almost treated as an object, right? And almost something outward, but yet it's inward, you know. And I just got curious about that kind of metaphor. Like, if it's part of us and it's who we are, right? Do we need to call it out to be like something different? So that's what that's why we're like, oh, that was an interesting thought. But that's sort of like that's why I went like this. But you know what, Kat, I kind of what I think about ego. The other thing that it hit me was that the definition of ego may be different in the Japanese culture than it is in our North American culture. So that was the thing that hit me too. That like, why is it they feel it's a bad thing? Maybe that they're referring it to as something in a different sense, but I'm not really quite sure because I'm not from that culture. But that just makes me think that people will have different definitions and they'll treat it always differently. And my thought is like, how do we just, you know, it is who we are. How do we integrate it and be able to learn from it versus pushing it to aside, right? So yeah, well, I guess that's the next thing here is like, how do we work with ego? Like, what is the best way to work with ego?
And what comes up for me when you say that, Joanne, is you know, if I think of ego as an integral part of myself rather than something that I perform, which look at me, I'm changing my opinions over the course of this conversation. But if I think of it as an integral part of myself rather than a performance or something that I have to put on, then it's sort of what comes up for me is, well, how do I love that part of myself rather than endure that part of myself, or express that part of myself, or suppress that part of myself. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting, because if I love it and it's integrated, then I like more is possible from that space.
Yeah. You're not fighting with it.
Yeah. Like one way or the other, like fighting to expose it or fighting to suppress it, because it really has felt like a fight prior to that. And that's a really interesting thing. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, there's three things that I just wrote down while we were talking over the last few minutes. Is there's this idea that some people are expected to suppress their ego. Some people are expected to weaponize their ego. Yeah. And some people think of it like Jake just put in the comment that ego can be a tool. And Jake, I would change the word tool and make it learning signals. It's not a tool like a hammer that we can sort of pick it up and put it away in our toolbox, but rather it's, if you think of this whole idea that our whole body is, you know, our whole nervous system, our whole body is critical in our survival and our thriving. And really what our ego is sort of representation of whether we're on track, whether we feel safe, whether we want to move forward, whether we feel competent and confident, or whether we feel threatened and we want to go into the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? So if you think that it's actually a whole series of signals and there is unbelievable power in our body wisdom, if we're willing to learn that language, then it's beyond a tool. It's basically like a whole aspect of ourselves that I think a lot of people haven't, huge numbers of people have not tapped into in the modern world, and especially the Western world, and even more so in the North American world. Yeah, so I think in terms of how do we work with it, how do we make it valuable, it's really, sometimes we do have to weaponize it, depending on the profession you're in, depending on the environment you're in. Sometimes we have to suppress it because that is part of our survival strategy. But ultimately, what we should always be doing is treating it as a learning signal. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then there's another thing as well, is we have to determine whether or not, determine how we want to show our ego. So that's kind of using it as a tool, how we present ourselves, how, do we appear confident? Do we make ourselves, do we puff ourselves up and sort of do all the posturing things that we're supposed to do to look competent and confident and everything else? What we also have to think about, and this is sort of maybe going back to the culture thing, in Japan, especially when I lived there, I'm not going to say how long ago, it was a while ago. But it was, and I think it still is, but I think there's been evolution. It was a very, very collectivist culture. And I worked at the largest bank in Japan. So it was a very powerful culture, very, and I also happened to work in the department that was the most powerful bank in Japan. So it was a really interesting observation. But even there, it was very, very collectivist versus North America, which is very individualistic, right? And we're always about individuating ourselves. How am I different? How am I better? Right. And in Japan, you don't want to be the tall poppy because the tall poppy is the one that gets cut. Right.
Mm.
So, our ego, we also have to be conscious of what environment are we in, and therefore, how do we use our ego in that environment to achieve the goals that we want to achieve? Because if we go in too egotistically into collectivist cultures or softer cultures or non-power oriented cultures, we're just going to annoy a lot of people. But if we go in sort of being collaborative, and we're going into a high power culture, and we're going into an individualistic culture, right? Which is, I worked in the money making side of the financial industry. It was all about eat what you kill. You leave the dead behind, you leave the injured behind. Like it just, there was very no humanity. It was a really fun place to work, as long as you weren't the one that was getting run over. It was, honestly, it was a lot of fun, but I mean, it was not a kind place, right?
Right.
And in that situation, you have to lead with ego. And as a woman, you had to do it the Grace Kelly way, which is backwards with a smile on your face, wearing high heels, right? So you always have to be conscious of the context, and then you have to figure out what's the real value to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm just looking at time because we've got 3 minutes left. When you say leading with ego, what comes up for me is not necessarily, I don't know, but maybe, we're different contexts here, but it's for me, it's like standing up for who I am right at this moment. Right. Like, it's just like, and it's not ego, it's Joanne integrated with every part of who she is. So, and that sometimes gets suppressed when I'm in a collective space, because, what did I say? Should I say, or whatever? And I actually lost it in the space I was in agile coaching for many years, because it's like, we hear what the team says, So it's like a part of me, or my identity was kind of like lost and suppressed. And it's only been in I don't know how many years ago when all of a sudden it became very like, oh my gosh, this is Joanne. Oh crap. And when that came out, it was really neat, but it can be overpowering sometimes too, right? So, which is pretty interesting. So, and how do you dial it back and not? But so that's what came up for me when you're saying leading with ego. It's just leading with full power Joanne, right? Like that's what's coming, but not in a way that's hurting others, type of thing,
Yes.
right? So, yeah.
And not in a way that's hurting the outcome that you want to achieve.
Yes.
I think if leading with full power Joanne or Kat or Todd also allows for the creation of space for the egos of others, then that's leading with ego in a way that can be built upon, that can be helpful. I think that's something that doesn't need to be either expressed very, very strongly or suppressed, because really it's the takeaway for me is we've all got it. So how do we make space for it within the context of leadership?
I think this idea of leading with leadership, there's 3 things that we need to balance. We need to figure out what's the real value we're bringing in that context. How are we perceiving what the real value is that we're bringing in that context? And those are not always correlated. And then there's a third part that I wasn't thinking about at the beginning of our conversation, which is, and what's required to achieve the goals that you want in that context, right? So that's the cultural you know, accommodating for the culture, accommodating for, do you need people to be more collaborative? Do you want people to be more collectivist? Or is there a situation where we actually need to have a leader who's standing out and taking charge? And sometimes that's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
But our
Excellent.
egos, we need to sort of weigh those three things to figure out how do we leverage the power of our physiology as it's expressed in our ego.
Yeah.
Wow,
I
lots
love
of
that.
wisdom and nuggets. So if we're going to wrap this up with something, is there anything we want to wrap it up with? Any final words?
Todd, do you
You know
wanna-
what? We've all got it. The thing that I like about it is that we've all got it. It's integral. It's part of me. And if I can lead with my whole authentic self and make room for your whole authentic self, then that's
Mhm.
leading with ego in a way that isn't damaging.
Mhm.
That's my takeaway from today.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
Anything
go.
else you want to add, Kat?
I think that's it. Embrace the healthy part of your ego, and do what you can to heal the unhealthy part of your ego.
Yeah.
I like that too.
That's wonderful, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It
I
is.
can't add anything else to it. So, and I know we're at time. So,
That's okay.
I'm not going to leave with my ego. Okay. Okay, great. Anyways, thank
That's
you all
wonderful.
for joining the call today and all your great comments. And I
Thank you
look
for
forward
the
to seeing
comments,
you
yeah.
in a couple weeks. Yeah. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank
That's
you so
right.
much. All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.